The Palace of Whispers. The fire crackled in the golden brazier, its flames dancing like hypnotic serpents against the marble walls of the royal palace. The stifling heat of the Persian night enveloped the halls like a shroud, the thick air heavy with the cloying scent of roses and incense, a fragrance that, within hours, would forever be associated with horror. In the shadows of the ornate pillars, hooded figures whispered in conspiratorial tones, their voices mingling with the distant sound of shattering wine goblets on the stone floor. It was 336 BC, and the Persian Empire was breathing its last moments of an era remembered for both its grandeur and its unfathomable brutality. Bagos, the eunuch who had once been a youth of extraordinary beauty captured in the Bactrian mountains, now moved through the palace corridors with the feline grace of one who knew every secret, every whisper, every breath that echoed between those walls. His skin still held the alabaster smoothness that had seduced emperors, but his eyes were now two black abysses reflecting decades of manipulation, betrayal, and blood. The silk fabric clinging to his slender frame rustled softly with each step, as if it were the very sound of death approaching. For 20 years, Bagos had been more than just a court favorite. He was the shadow behind the throne, the venomous whisper in the king's ear, the silent architect of destinies that stretched from the sands of Libya to the frozen mountains of Scythia. His delicate hands, adorned with emerald and ruby rings, had signed death warrants disguised as perfumed letters. His melodious voice had uttered words that toppled entire dynasties. And his smile, that smile that had captivated kings, concealed a calculating mind that turned men into puppets and dreams into nightmares. The palace of Persepolis had never been more magnificent than in those final days. The columns rose like titans of stone, supporting a ceiling that seemed to touch the heavens themselves. Priceless Persian carpets covered the floors, their vibrant colors telling tales of glorious battles and epic conquests. The air was constantly perfumed with rare essences brought from the far corners of the known world, and the sound of musical instruments echoed softly through the halls, creating an atmosphere of luxury and sophistication that masked the rot growing at the heart of the empire. Bagos had built his power on the bodies of those who dared to defy him. Artaxerxes III, the great king, had been only the first in a long list of victims. Poison, his preferred tool, had become an extension of his very being. He knew every lethal plant that grew in the imperial gardens, every potion that could kill in seconds or torture for days. His hands had prepared concoctions that transformed powerful men into convulsing corpses, and his lips had whispered lies so sweet that his victims died thanking him for their release. During the reign of Artaxerxes III, Bagos had been the power behind the silken curtains that separated the throne from the rest of the world. He decided who lived and who died, who prospered and who withered in the palace's dark dungeons. Entire satraps trembled at the sound of his name whispered in the corridors, and ambassadors from distant kingdoms brought gifts not to the king, but to him, knowing that it was his approval that would determine the fate of their people. Power had transformed Bagos into something more and less than human. He no longer knew the taste of fear, only the sadistic pleasure of inspiring it in others. His nights were spent among scrolls containing the empire's darkest secrets, and his days were dedicated to weaving the webs of intrigue that maintained his unassailable position. He had become the poison coursing through the veins of the Persian Empire, essential to its existence, yet lethal to its soul. The death of Artaxerxes III had been his masterpiece.
The king, who had once trusted him like a son, had died in agony, his insides liquefying as Bagos held his hand, whispering words of comfort in the same voice that had ordered his execution. The poison had been administered slowly, over weeks, disguised in the rare wines the king so cherished. Each sip had been a step toward the abyss, and Bagos had savored every moment of that descent into hell. With Artaxerxes III dead, Bagos had placed Arsis, the young prince, on the throne. Arsis was a perfect puppet, young, insecure, desperate for the approval of the man who had been his father's confidant. But youth brought with it a dangerous quality, the ability to grow, to learn, to eventually question. And questioning Bagos was a death sentence. During the 2 years of Arsis's reign, Bagos had ruled the empire with an iron fist in a silken glove. He had crushed rebellions before they could even be born, eliminated rivals before they could breathe, and woven a spy network so complex that not even the birds sang without his knowledge. His influence extended from the sacred temples to the most sordid brothels, and his word was law in an empire that spanned 3 continents. But absolute power brings with it absolute loneliness. Bagos had no friends, only temporary allies. He had no love, only calculated passions. He had no family, only pawns in his eternal game. He had sacrificed his humanity on the altar of ambition, and what remained was a creature of terrible beauty, fueled by the blood of those who dared to defy him. Arsis's transformation had been gradual but inevitable. The young king, initially grateful for Bagos's guidance, had begun to question certain decisions. Small things at first, an execution that seemed unnecessary, an alliance that benefited Bagos more than the empire. But these small seeds of doubt had grown into a rebellious tree that threatened to overshadow all the power Bagos had built. Arsis's death had been necessary but dangerous. 2 kings dead in quick succession aroused suspicion even in the most corrupt court. Bagos had been forced to be more subtle, more careful. The poison this time had been disguised as a natural illness, and the tears he shed at the funeral had been genuine, not of sorrow, but of frustration at the need to eliminate a useful tool. With Arsis's death, Bagos had turned to Darius III, a distant cousin of the royal family. Darius was different, older, more experienced, more suspicious. He had accepted the throne reluctantly, knowing it came with a price that might be paid in blood. But Bagos had been persuasive, as always. His words had flowed like poisoned honey, painting a glorious future for the empire under Darius's leadership, with himself as the loyal and indispensable advisor. The first few months of Darius III's reign had been almost idyllic. The new king had shown appropriate deference to Bagos, consulting him on important decisions and following his suggestions with the docility of a lamb.
Bagoas had allowed himself to believe he had finally found the perfect puppet, intelligent enough to be useful, but intimidated enough to be controlled. But Darius III had been a diligent student of recent history. He had observed the fate of his predecessors with the eyes of a man who understood that shared power was no power at all. Slowly, silently, he had begun to build his own network of loyalties, courting generals Bagoas had considered safe, bribing spies who had sworn eternal loyalty to the eunuch, and planting seeds of doubt about the true nature of the mysterious deaths that had marked the empire's recent years. Bagoas's perception of the shift had been gradual, like the arrival of winter. First, small things, a hesitation before signing an execution order, a question about the necessity of a particular alliance. Then, more obvious changes, private meetings from which he was excluded, appointments made without his consultation, decrees issued without his approval. The scent of betrayal had begun to hang in the air of the palace, almost imperceptible at first, but growing until it became a stench that not even the flowers of the imperial gardens could mask. The network of spies Bagoas had built over decades had begun to turn against him. Reports arrived less frequently, and when they did, they were vague, evasive, clearly edited to omit vital information. His closest allies had begun to avoid his gaze, and conversations would stop abruptly when he entered a room. The palace, which had been his kingdom for so long, was becoming his prison. If you've been following these dark narratives of ancient history, consider subscribing to the channel to avoid missing the next installments that explore the most intense and revealing moments of the human condition across the centuries. Paranoia, the constant companion of the powerful, had begun to gnaw at Bagoas's mind like an insatiable worm. He had begun to test his food before eating it, to check his drinks for signs of poison, to sleep with a dagger under his pillow. Ironically, the master of poison had begun to fear being poisoned, and the architect of conspiracies had begun to see conspiracies in every shadow. The signs of his impending downfall had become unmistakable during the preparations for the campaign against Alexander of Macedon. Darius III had personally assumed command of military operations, consulting generals Bagoas had considered his personal enemies. The eunuch had found himself relegated to minor administrative matters, his opinions on military strategy being politely ignored. It was as if he were watching his own funeral while still breathing. The physical beauty that had been his first weapon had begun to show signs of wear. His eyes, once bright with the light of ambition, had become dull and bloodshot. His skin, which had been compared to marble by court poets, had taken on a sickly pallor. His hands, which had been admired for their delicacy, now trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. The stress of constant paranoia had begun to corrode not only his mind but also his body. The nights had become his particular torment. He walked the palace corridors like a ghost, unable to find rest, haunted by visions of the men he had killed and by the ghosts of futures that would not be. The sound of his own footsteps echoing on the marble had become a symphony of loneliness, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Darius III had begun to consolidate his power with the efficiency of a man who understood that time was his enemy. He had removed Bagoas's supporters from key positions, replacing them with men whose loyalty had been bought with gold and pledged with oaths. He had reformed the palace communication system, creating channels of information that completely bypassed the eunuch. Most importantly, he had begun to discreetly investigate the mysterious deaths that had marked the empire's recent years. The investigation had been conducted with a surgeon's precision and an assassin's discretion. Darius III had enlisted court physicians to examine the bodies of Artaxerxes III and Arsis, and their findings had been revealing. Traces of rare poisons had been found in both corpses, poisons that only someone with intimate knowledge of the art of poisoning could have administered. Witnesses had been found, servants who had seen Bagoas preparing mysterious concoctions, guards who had noted his constant presence near the victims before their deaths. The noose had tightened around Bagoas like a constricting serpent. He had realized that his movements were being monitored, his conversations overheard, his correspondence intercepted. The palace, once his absolute domain, had become an elaborate trap, and he was simultaneously hunter and hunted. Bagoas's last attempt to regain his power had been pathetic in its transparency. He had tried to orchestrate a coup against Darius III, recruiting loyal guards and disgruntled generals in a conspiracy that had been uncovered before it could be executed. His co-conspirators had been arrested overnight, and in the morning he had awakened to find royal guard soldiers stationed outside his chambers, not to protect him, but to watch him. The final confrontation had taken place in the palace's Great Hall, beneath paintings celebrating the glories of the Persian Empire. Darius III entered in full regal splendor, followed by his generals and advisors. Bagoas had been brought in, chained, his silken robes stained and torn, his once radiant beauty now degraded by the reality of his situation. The contrast between the man who had ruled an empire and the prisoner now trembling before the throne was devastating. The accusations were read in a voice that echoed through the halls like a death knell. Murder of two kings, treason against the empire, conspiracy against the throne, corruption of sacred traditions. Each word fell upon Bagoas like a physical blow, and he felt decades of power dissolving like salt in water. His defense was pitiful. He begged, cried, pleaded for mercy. He offered treasures, secrets, even his own life in exchange for clemency. But Darius III remained impassive, his face a marble mask revealing nothing but cold, calculated determination. The sentence was pronounced in the same voice that had read the accusations: death by forced ingestion of burning coals. The method of execution had been chosen with cruel symbolism. Bagoas, who had used refined poisons to kill his enemies, would be killed by the most primitive and brutal elements, fire and iron. The irony had not been lost on anyone present, and the murmur of approval from the courtiers was like a symphony of vengeance. The preparations for the execution had been as meticulous as the conspiracies Bagoas had orchestrated. A special brazier had been prepared, not a simple iron bowl, but a work of art in gilded bronze, decorated with reliefs depicting scenes of divine justice. The charcoal had been carefully selected, chosen for its ability to retain heat for extended periods. The coals had been heated until they reached a temperature that made the surrounding air shimmer like water. Bagoas had been dragged to the center of the hall, where the brazier awaited like a pagan altar. The heat radiating from the metal had been so intense that even the closest guards had instinctively recoiled. The smell of burning charcoal had mingled with the scent of incense that always permeated the palace, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously sacred and profane. Bagos's final moments had been an agony that transcended the merely physical. He had been forced to kneel before the brazier, his hands bound behind his back, his head held erect by guards who grasped his hair. The heat had begun to sear his face even before the first coal was withdrawn with iron tongs. His tears had dried before they could even trace paths down his cheeks. The first coal had been placed on his tongue with the precision of a religious ritual. The sound that escaped his throat had not been human. It was something primal, animal, speaking directly to the most basic survival instincts. His tongue hissed like meat on a grill, and the smell of burning flesh had mingled with the aroma of spices that perfumed the hall. But a single coal had not been enough. A second had followed, then a third, each forced into his mouth as he convulsed in agony. His vocal cords had been destroyed by the first coal, so his screams had become only raspy, bubbling whispers. His hands, had they been free, would have clawed at his own throat in a desperate attempt to remove the coals that were literally cooking his flesh from the inside out. The fire had consumed his tongue, then his throat, then his airways. Each breath had become torture, each attempt to swallow a fresh wave of agony. His body had begun to convulse violently, his muscles contracting in spasms that seemed to want to eject his own skin. His eyes, which had witnessed so much horror over the years, had rolled back to show only white, as if even his vision was trying to escape the reality of what was happening. The process had lasted nearly an hour, an eternity of suffering concentrated into a single moment. Bagoas died as he had lived, in agony, surrounded by enemies, utterly alone. His beauty had become a mask of burned flesh, his voice had become silence, and his mind had become a coal consumed by its own flames. The body was left where it fell,
a stark warning to anyone with similar ambitions. The smell of burning flesh lingered in the hall for days, mingling with the scent of flowers to create an aroma none present would ever forget. Servants whispered that Bagos's ghost haunted the corridors, seeking water for his eternal burns. Darius III ordered the body removed eventually, but not buried. Instead, it was burned on a common pyre, the ashes scattered to the wind. No monument was erected, no prayers were said. Bagos vanished from history like a shadow dissipating at dawn. The irony of his death wasn't lost on the more perceptive observers. Bagos, who had used poison as his weapon of choice, a relatively quick and merciful death, had been killed by the slowest, most agonizing method imaginable. He had spent decades inflicting death and suffering, but his own demise surpassed in horror anything he had ever inflicted on others. The Persian Empire continued, but it was never the same. Bagos's death was a turning point, a moment when absolute power met its own limitations. Darius III had set a precedent. Even the most powerful of advisors, even the closest confidant, could be brought down if they crossed the invisible lines separating influence from treachery. But Bagos's story became more than just a cautionary tale about the consequences of absolute power. It became a mirror in which other powerful men could see their own potential futures. Beauty turning to horror, intelligence corrupting into cunning, loyalty degrading into betrayal. All these elements were crystallized in the figure of a man who had come so close to ruling the world that he forgot he was mortal. In the years that followed, Bagos's story became a whispered legend in the courts and palaces of the ancient world. His death became a symbol of the ultimate price of unchecked ambition, and his life became a study of how power corrupts not only those who wield it, but also those who linger in its shadows. The golden brazier used in his execution became a macabre relic, passed down through generations of royal executioners. It was said to still hold the heat of that terrible day, and that anyone who gazed into its embers could see a reflection of Bagos's final moments. Eventually, it disappeared during one of the many wars that ravaged the region, but its legacy remained, a reminder that even the mightiest of men is merely flesh and bone, vulnerable to fire and steel. Bagos's death was more than an execution. It was a collective catharsis, a purification by fire that consumed not just a man, but an era. The Persian Empire emerged from his death like a phoenix from the ashes, renewed and strengthened by the elimination of the cancer that had grown in its heart. But like all purifications, it left scars that would never fully heal. In his final moments, as the embers finally consumed his ability to think, Bagos perhaps understood a fundamental truth about power and mortality. He had built an empire on fear, only to discover that fear is a double-edged sword. He had used death as a tool, only to discover that death makes no distinction between executioner and victim. He had sought immortality through influence, only to discover that all influence is temporary, and that all men, no matter how powerful, eventually turn to ash. Bagos's story remains a testament to the fundamental fragility of the human condition. No matter how high a man may climb, how deeply he may dig his roots into the soil of power, or how completely he may dominate those around him, he remains fundamentally mortal, fundamentally vulnerable, fundamentally human. The fire that consumed Bagos was not just an execution, but a revelation that behind every mask of power exists only another human face, as fragile and mortal as any other. And so, in the embers that glowed on that terrible night in Persepolis, we can see reflected not just the death of a man, but the death of an illusion. The illusion that power can transcend mortality, that influence can replace humanity, and that cunning can defeat the inevitability of justice. Bagos had lived like a god, but he died like a man. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful lesson of all.